The first thing I heard was the sound of a steel stake being hammered into the ground. Not one strike, not two, a whole line of them. Clang, clang, clang. The noise echoed across my property before sunrise, tearing through the morning silence like gunshots. At first, I thought it was construction happening somewhere down the road. Our neighborhood had been changing for years. New homes, new developments, new people with expensive SUVs and opinions about everyone else's property. But then my phone exploded with messages. Mark, get outside. Something's happening on your land. You need to see this right now. I was still half asleep when I stepped onto my back porch. The coffee mug nearly slipped from my hand. 40 feet. They had moved my property line 40 feet overnight. A bright orange construction fence stretched across what had always been my family's land. Fresh survey stakes stood in a perfectly straight line cutting through my yard, my garden, and even part of the old stone pathway my grandfather built with his own hands nearly 60 years earlier. For a moment, I honestly couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain refused to accept it. The maple tree that had always stood near the center of my property was now on the opposite side of the fence. According to whoever had done this, the tree no longer belonged to me. Neither did half my yard. Neither did the memorial bench dedicated to my grandmother. Neither did a section of the pond my father spent years restoring. It looked like someone had taken a giant knife and sliced away a massive chunk of my life. I stood frozen. The cool morning air felt suddenly suffocating. Then I saw the three men wearing reflective construction vests, and standing beside them was the woman responsible for every nightmare that would follow. Diane Whitmore, president of the HOA. She was holding a clipboard, smiling, actually smiling, as if she were watching a landscaping project instead of stealing part of someone's property. I stormed across the grass. What the hell is this? The workers stopped hammering. Diane looked up calmly. Oh, good morning, Mark. Good morning. As though this was a normal conversation. As though I hadn't just discovered that nearly half an acre of my land had been fenced off. What is this? I shouted again. She glanced at her clipboard. The corrected property boundary. I stared at her. The what? The corrected property boundary. She pointed toward the survey markers. There was an error in previous records. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd that my brain didn't know how else to react. An error? Yes. You're telling me my family owned this land for 70 years and suddenly there's an error? She shrugged. According to our surveyor. Our surveyor? Our HOA surveyor. The words hit me like a slap. Not county surveyors. Not court-appointed experts, not government records. Her surveyor, a man hired by the HOA. I looked toward the fence again. 40 feet. 40 entire feet. Thousands upon thousands of square feet simply reassigned overnight. No. I shook my head. No, absolutely not. Diane's smile never moved. You can file an appeal if you'd like. If I'd like? I stepped closer. That's my property. According to the updated measurements, it is not. I could feel neighbors gathering, watching, phones appearing, whispers spreading. The kind of neighborhood spectacle people secretly enjoy when it isn't happening to them. I pointed toward the memorial bench. My grandmother's bench is over there. Diane glanced at it. Then perhaps you should move it. Something inside me snapped. Move it. Before landscaping begins. The workers suddenly became very interested in their boots. Even they seemed uncomfortable. I took a deep breath. Then another. Because I knew if I didn't, I was going to say something that would end badly. Who approved this? The board. The board doesn't own my property. The board manages community assets. This isn't a community asset. Diane smiled again. Apparently it is now. The words landed like gasoline on a fire. I remember the exact feeling. The pulse in my neck, the heat rising into my face, the trembling in my hands. I had never experienced rage that pure before. Not because of the land. Not entirely. It was the arrogance. The certainty, the complete belief that she could rewrite reality because she sat at the head of a homeowners association. Then came the second shock. A black SUV pulled into my driveway. Another one followed. Then another. Attorneys. HOA attorneys. 3 of them. Standing on my property as though they owned the place. One approached carrying a folder. Mr. Dawson, who are you? Counsel representing the association. He handed me paperwork. I didn't even want to touch it. What is this? Official notice. I opened the packet. My stomach dropped. Violation warnings, compliance notices, potential fines, threats of legal action. All prepared before I had even walked outside, before I had even known there was a dispute. They had planned everything, every document, every threat. Every next step. The realization hit me harder than the fence itself. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate, organized, calculated. Months of preparation carried out behind closed doors, and I was only now finding out. I looked around. The workers, the lawyers, the HOA president, the fresh survey stakes, the fence, the paperwork. Every piece fit together. This had been choreographed. I wasn't witnessing the beginning of a conflict. I was arriving in the middle of an ambush. The attorney adjusted his tie. If you cooperate, this can proceed smoothly. I looked directly into his eyes. And if I don't? The smile disappeared. Then additional remedies may be pursued. Additional remedies. Such polite words for intimidation. I folded the paperwork. Slowly. Carefully. Then I looked past all of them toward the old oak tree near the edge of the property. The tree my grandfather planted when my father was born. The tree standing exactly where every historical survey showed the boundary line. A memory surfaced. Something my grandfather once told me. Always trust measurements that survive generations, not measurements that appear overnight. At that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to negotiate. Instead, I would do something much worse. I would force the truth into the open. I looked back at Diane, then at the survey stakes, then at the attorneys, and finally at the fence. You know what? I said quietly. What? Diane replied. I smiled for the first time that morning. Let's let a judge measure it himself. For the first time all day, her expression changed, only slightly. Just enough. A flicker, a crack in the confidence, a tiny glimpse of fear. And that was the moment I knew something wasn't right. Because innocent people don't fear measurements. Only people who already know what those measurements will reveal. My name is Mark Dawson. I'm 43 years old. And for most of my life I've believed that hard work solves almost everything. Maybe that's because of how I was raised. Maybe it's because I grew up watching people who never quit, even when life gave them every reason to. Long before lawyers, survey maps, courtrooms, and HOA board meetings became part of my daily vocabulary, I was just a kid running barefoot across a stretch of land that felt bigger than the entire world. The property at the center of this story wasn't simply where I lived. It was where I learned who I was. I was born in a small town outside Cedar Ridge, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where people still waved from pickup trucks, and where family names carried stories stretching back generations. My grandfather, Walter Dawson, was one of those men everyone respected. Not because he was wealthy, he wasn't. Not because he held political office, he didn't. People respected him because his word meant something. When Walter Dawson promised something, it happened. When he shook your hand, you didn't need a contract. That was the kind of man he was. Some of my earliest memories involve following him around the property. I remember tiny details that somehow never left me. The smell of freshly cut pine, the rough texture of old fence posts beneath my fingertips, the sound of frogs near the pond after rainstorms, the way morning sunlight filtered through the massive oak trees near the southern boundary. Most kids spent summers playing video games. I spent mine learning how to repair fences, clear brush, and identify property markers. Back then, I didn't realize those lessons would someday save me. To me, it was just time with Grandpa. I adored him. Everyone did. When I was 9 years old, he gave me a worn leather notebook. Inside were sketches of the property, hand-drawn maps, boundary measurements, notes about trees, wells, drainage paths, and landmarks. At the time, it seemed boring. I remember laughing. Why would anybody care about old property lines? He looked at me seriously. Because land remembers things people forget. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. But years later, those words would echo in my head more times than I could count. My childhood wasn't perfect. Far from it. My father worked construction. My mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Money was always tight. There were years when every dollar mattered. Years when broken appliances felt like financial emergencies. Years when vacations were impossible. But despite all that, I never felt poor. We had the property. We had family. We had purpose. My parents taught me something that shaped my entire life. You don't measure wealth by what's in your bank account. You measure it by what cannot be taken away. At least that's what we believed. Back then, nobody imagined someone would actually try. School wasn't easy for me. I wasn't the smartest student. I wasn't the most athletic. I wasn't popular. I was quiet. Observant. The kid who paid attention while everyone else was talking. Teachers often described me the same way. Reliable. As a teenager, I hated that word. Reliable sounded boring. Now I wear it like a badge of honor, because reliability builds things. It builds businesses. It builds trust. It builds families. And eventually, it builds resilience. After high school, I couldn't afford a fancy university. I attended community college while working nights. There were months when I survived on coffee, instant noodles, and stubbornness. Most people never saw that part. They see who I became. They don't see how many times I nearly quit. At 22, I landed my first full-time job in land development consulting. Ironically, that's where I learned how property disputes really work. Survey reports, boundary records, county filings, title histories, easements, encroachments, zoning issues. At the time, I viewed it as just another job. I had no idea those skills would someday become weapons. Over the years, I built a stable career. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy, but enough to support myself, enough to maintain the property after my parents grew older, enough to keep family history alive. Then life happened. The kind of life nobody plans for. My father passed away first. Heart attack. Unexpected. One day he was helping repair a shed. The next day, he was gone. The loss shattered our family. My mother never fully recovered. She tried, but grief has a way of changing people. 3 years later, cancer took her too. By then, the property felt different, quieter, heavier. Every corner carried memories. Every building held echoes. Some days walking across the land felt comforting. Other days, it felt like carrying an invisible weight. Friends often asked why I didn't sell. The answer was simple. Because leaving would feel like abandoning them. Every tree had a story. Every pathway had a memory. Every structure represented years of sacrifice. Selling wasn't just a financial decision. It would have been an emotional surrender. So I stayed. I maintained everything myself. The fences, the pond, the gardens, the trails, the old barn. Some weekends I'd spend 12 hours working outdoors, not because I had to, because I wanted to, because preserving something meaningful felt important. The world was changing rapidly around us. Developers were buying land everywhere. Historic properties disappeared. Fields became subdivisions. Forests became parking lots. Family legacies became profit opportunities. Watching it happen always bothered me. Not because development is inherently bad, because history disappears faster than people realize. Once it's gone forever. Around that same time, the HOA began growing more powerful. When the neighborhood was first established, the association handled simple things: maintenance, community events, basic regulations. Nothing controversial. But over the years, new leadership arrived. Different priorities emerged. Control expanded. Rules multiplied. Fees increased. Influence grew. That's when Diane Whitmore appeared. At first, I barely noticed her. She seemed ambitious, organized, polished, the type of person who always had a 5-year plan. Many residents admired her. Some feared her. Most simply stayed out of her way. I belonged to the last group. I had no interest in neighborhood politics, no interest in board meetings, no interest in power struggles. I just wanted to maintain my property and live peacefully. Looking back, that may have been my biggest mistake, because while I was focused on preserving family history, people like Diane were focused on expanding authority, and authority, when left unchecked, tends to grow. The older I became, the more I valued simple things: honesty, fairness, responsibility, keeping promises. Those values sound old-fashioned now. Maybe they are, but they're the foundation of everything I believe. That's why what happened with the property hit me so hard. It wasn't merely about land. It wasn't about square footage. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. If someone could erase 40 feet of property overnight, simply because they had influence, what stopped them from taking more? If documents could be manipulated, what did ownership even mean? If history could be rewritten, what protected anyone? Those questions haunted me, not just for myself, for everyone. Because deep down, I knew something most people didn't. The moment this stopped being about property lines, it became about principles, and people will tolerate a tax on their possessions far longer than they'll tolerate a tax on their principles. I had fears. Of course I did. Anyone who claims otherwise is lying. I feared losing the land. I feared losing the memories attached to it. I feared being financially crushed by legal battles. I feared standing alone against people with more money, more connections, and more influence. But another fear outweighed all the others. The fear of doing nothing. The fear of looking back years later and realizing I surrendered without a fight. That fear was stronger, much stronger. And standing in my yard that morning, staring at the orange fence cutting through generations of family history, I realized something important. Diane Whitmore thought she was fighting over property. The attorneys thought they were managing a dispute. The HOA board thought they were enforcing authority, but they misunderstood the person standing in front of them. Because I wasn't defending a piece of land, I was defending the people who built it. And there is a dangerous kind of determination that appears when someone believes they're protecting the legacy of those they loved. The HOA hadn't just challenged my ownership. They had awakened a fight they never saw coming. If you looked at the property from a satellite image, you probably wouldn't understand why it mattered so much. You would see a few acres of land on the edge of Cedar Ridge, some trees, a pond, an old barn, a modest house, a gravel driveway winding through patches of grass and oak trees. Nothing that would immediately catch your attention, nothing that screamed wealth. Nothing that looked extraordinary. But that is the thing about family legacies. Their value rarely appears in photographs. Their value lives in the stories attached to them. Every inch of that land carried a story. Every boundary marker represented a memory. Every tree had witnessed generations of my family living, struggling, celebrating, and surviving. The property first entered our family in 1954. My grandfather, Walter Dawson, bought it after returning home from military service. At the time, nobody wanted the land. It was considered difficult property, partially wooded, poor road access, uneven terrain, no modern utilities. Most people saw problems. Grandpa saw opportunity. According to family stories, he paid less than the cost of a new pickup truck. Friends told him he was making a mistake. Neighbors laughed. Some even called the land worthless, but Grandpa ignored them. He always had a habit of seeing value where others saw inconvenience. The first years were brutal. The property wasn't ready for a family. There was no proper house, no reliable water system, no electricity, nothing. My grandparents lived in a small, temporary structure, while slowly building a home with their own hands. Not contractors, not developers, them. Board by board, nail by nail, weekend after weekend. The house standing on the property today still contains parts of that original structure. Every time I walk through the front door, I know exactly which walls my grandfather built. I know which beams my father later reinforced. I know which sections my mother painted herself. The house isn't just a building, it's a timeline, a physical record of the people who lived there. Growing up, family gatherings were legendary. Thanksgiving dinners spilled into every room. Birthdays filled the yard with folding chairs and laughter. Summer barbecues stretched late into the night. Kids raced through fields, while adults swapped stories around fire pits. I can still hear those sounds if I close my eyes. The laughter, the conversations, the music, the feeling that no matter what happened in the outside world, everything was okay here. That feeling became part of the property itself. One of the most important landmarks sat near the southern edge, a massive oak tree. Its branches stretched outward like giant arms, protecting the land beneath it. Grandpa planted it in 1958 when my father was born. He documented everything. The exact date, the exact location, even photographs. Over the decades, the tree became more than a tree. It became a family symbol. Every major event seemed connected to it. Family portraits, graduation photos, wedding pictures, memorial services. The oak tree appeared in all of them. When my father passed away, we placed a memorial plaque beneath its shade, not because of tradition, because it felt right, because the tree had always been there, steady, unchanging, a witness to everything. Nearby stood the stone pathway. Most people would have walked past it without a second glance, but I knew its history. Grandpa and my father built it together during one particularly difficult summer. Money was tight. The family couldn't afford vacations. Instead, they spent weekends collecting stones from nearby fields and carefully placing them by hand. The pathway wasn't expensive, it wasn't impressive, but it represented perseverance, a reminder that meaningful things are often built slowly. Then there was the pond. The pond had its own story. Years before I was born, drainage issues threatened the property. Heavy rains repeatedly flooded parts of the land. Rather than sell or complain, my father spent years reshaping the area, digging, clearing, reinforcing banks, planting vegetation. The pond became one of the property's most beautiful features. Wildlife returned. Fish appeared. Birds nested nearby. The place transformed into a peaceful retreat. I spent countless afternoons there, Fishing, reading, thinking, healing. After my parents passed away, the pond became my sanctuary. Whenever life felt overwhelming, I'd sit by the water and remember their voices, remember their advice. Remember the values they spent decades teaching me. That pond helped me survive grief. Most people never understand how places can become emotional anchors until they lose one, or almost lose one. The property's history wasn't based solely on memories. It was documented, meticulously. Grandpa trusted records. He believed future generations needed proof, not just stories. Over the years, he accumulated an extraordinary collection of documents, survey maps, boundary certificates, tax records, purchase agreements, photographs, letters, engineering sketches, maintenance logs, everything. The collection filled multiple filing cabinets. As a child, I thought he was obsessive. As an adult, I realized he was preparing for something, maybe not this exact conflict, but something. Because he understood a simple truth: memories fade, documents endure. One particular survey became especially important later, the original 1954 boundary survey. The paper itself looked ancient, yellowed edges, faded ink, creases from decades of handling, yet the measurements remained clear. Every corner marker, every boundary line, every reference point, including the exact location of the southern property line, the same line the HOA would later claim had somehow moved 40 feet. The absurdity still amazes me, because anyone who genuinely studied the property's history could immediately see the problem. Nothing had changed. The trees remained where they had always been. The stone markers remained where they had always been. The historical measurements matched county records. Even aerial photographs spanning decades showed identical boundaries. The evidence wasn't hidden. It was everywhere, which made the HOA's actions even more disturbing, because they weren't correcting a mistake. They were attempting to overwrite reality. Around 10 years before the dispute began, developers started showing interest in neighboring land. That changed everything. Property values increased. Construction accelerated. Investment opportunities appeared. Suddenly, land that had been ignored for generations became valuable. Very valuable. And valuable land attracts attention, sometimes the wrong kind. Several times developers approached me. Their offers grew larger every year. At first they offered enough money to buy another home. Later, they offered enough to retire comfortably. Friends thought I was crazy for refusing. Some still do. Why not sell? It's just land. You could start over somewhere else. But they didn't understand. The property wasn't inventory. It wasn't an investment vehicle. It wasn't a financial asset sitting on a spreadsheet. It was family history. You cannot calculate family history using market value. You cannot replace it with a check. You cannot recreate it somewhere else. The land connected 4 generations of Dawsons. That connection mattered. Far more than money. As development expanded, the HOA became increasingly involved in planning discussions, community growth, infrastructure projects, new amenities, expanded facilities. Those conversations seemed harmless at first. Then certain proposals started appearing. Walking paths, green spaces, common use areas, expanded recreational access. Most residents loved the ideas. I did too, until I noticed something strange. Many proposed improvements seemed to require land located suspiciously close to my southern boundary, the same boundary eventually targeted by Diane Whitmore. At the time, I dismissed the concern. Coincidence, I thought. Surely nobody would attempt something so reckless. Surely nobody would challenge 70 years of documented ownership. Surely nobody would risk legal disaster over a property line. I was wrong. Dangerously wrong. Because while I viewed the property as a legacy worth protecting, other people viewed it as an obstacle standing in the way of their plans, and obstacles in their minds were meant to be removed. What they failed to understand was that this land wasn't merely a piece of real estate. It was the foundation of my family's story. Every survey map, every photograph, every boundary marker, every recorded measurement, every memory, everything pointed to the same truth. The property belonged exactly where it had always been, and anyone attempting to move that line wasn't simply attacking ownership. They were attempting to erase generations of history. That was something I could never allow. No matter how powerful the HOA became, no matter how expensive the fight grew, and no matter how long the battle would ultimately last. The morning everything broke began like any other. Looking back now, That's the part that feels the strangest. Life-changing moments rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with dramatic music or warning signs. They sneak into ordinary mornings, quiet mornings, routine mornings, the kind of mornings you forget almost immediately. At least, that's how it started. I woke up just before sunrise. The sky outside my bedroom window was still dark blue, slowly fading into grey as dawn approached. A light fog hovered over parts of the property, especially near the pond. The air carried that cool, earthy smell that always followed a humid summer night. For a few minutes, I simply lay there listening. The distant chirping of birds, the rustling leaves outside, the familiar creaks of an old house settling into another day. Everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. I had absolutely no idea that within an hour, my life would be turned upside down. I got dressed, started a pot of coffee, and stepped onto the porch. The world looked beautiful. Morning sunlight was just beginning to filter through the trees. Tiny droplets of dew covered the grass like scattered diamonds. Mist drifted across the pond. For a brief moment, I felt grateful. Grateful for the property. Grateful for the quiet. Grateful for another day. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from my neighbor, Tom Reynolds. Tom wasn't the type to send messages early in the morning. That alone caught my attention. The message read, "Mark, are you seeing this?" Before I could reply, another message arrived, this time from Sarah Mitchell, who lived 2 properties away. "You need to get outside, now." My stomach tightened. Something felt wrong immediately. I looked around from the porch but couldn't see anything unusual. The property seemed exactly as it always had. Then my phone rang. "Tom." I answered instantly. "Tom?" His voice sounded tense. "Mark, where are you?" "At home." "Go toward your south field." My heart skipped. "Why?" There was a pause, a long pause. The kind that tells you the answer isn't good. "Just go." I didn't even finish my coffee. I set the mug down and started walking. At first I moved quickly, then faster. The further I walked, the more uneasy I became. The southern section of the property sat beyond a line of oak trees and open grassland. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred yards from the house, but the journey felt strangely different that morning. The air seemed heavier, the silence felt unnatural. Even the birds sounded quieter. Halfway there I noticed tire tracks, fresh tire tracks. Deep impressions in the damp ground, multiple vehicles, large vehicles, construction vehicles. I stopped, confused. Nobody had permission to be there, nobody. The tracks continued toward the southern boundary. I followed them. My pulse quickened with every step. As I reached the edge of the tree line, I heard it. Clang, 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 metal striking metal. The sound echoed across the field. At first I couldn't see what was making it. Then I stepped into the clearing, and everything changed. For several seconds I genuinely thought I was looking at the wrong property. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Bright orange construction fencing stretched across the landscape. Survey stakes stood in perfect alignment. Heavy equipment sat nearby. Workers moved methodically through the area, and a section of my land had effectively been cut away. I remember standing completely still, frozen, unable to speak, unable to think. The scene felt surreal, like a dream or a hallucination. The memorial bench dedicated to my grandmother sat behind the fence. The stone pathway built by my father and grandfather disappeared beyond the markers. Part of the pond shoreline now appeared outside what the new boundary supposedly claimed was my property. Nothing made sense. Absolutely nothing. I walked forward slowly, almost mechanically, trying to understand, trying to find some logical explanation. There had to be one. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had placed the markers incorrectly. Then I saw the sign. The sign changed everything. It had been attached to one of the fence posts. Official property boundary adjustment, authorized by Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped. Boundary adjustment? Authorized by the HOA. I read it again. And again. The words didn't become any less absurd. The HOA couldn't move property lines. They weren't a government agency. They weren't a court. They weren't landowners. So how was this happening? As I stared at the sign, a worker noticed me. He lowered his hammer. The expression on his face immediately told me something important. He knew who I was. And he looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. I approached. "What is this?" The worker glanced toward the other side of the field. I followed his gaze. That's when I saw her, Diane Whitmore, standing near a black SUV, holding a clipboard, watching everything. The moment our eyes met, I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. She wasn't surprised to see me. She wasn't confused. She wasn't concerned. She looked prepared. That realization hit harder than anything else, because prepared people don't accidentally steal 40 feet of someone's property. Prepared people plan. Prepared people coordinate. Prepared people expect resistance. I walked directly toward her. Every step felt heavier, every heartbeat louder. The workers stopped talking. The field became eerily quiet. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees remained. When I reached her, she smiled. Actually smiled. "Good morning, Mark." I stared at her. "What have you done?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at her clipboard as though reviewing a grocery list. Then she looked back up. "We've corrected a long-standing boundary issue." The words felt rehearsed, practiced, prepared. I pointed toward the fence. "That's my property. According to updated measurements, it isn't." My jaw tightened. "What updated measurements?" "Our survey. Our survey." I repeated the words slowly, trying to keep my temper under control. "Your survey doesn't override 70 years of ownership." She folded her arms. "Ownership records can contain errors." I laughed, not because I found anything funny, because the statement was so outrageous. "So every survey, every tax record, every county document, every aerial photograph for 7 decades is wrong?" She shrugged. "If they relied on incorrect data, yes." The confidence in her voice sent chills through me, not because she sounded right, because she sounded certain. People become dangerous when they're convinced they cannot be challenged. I looked around again. The workers, the fencing, the equipment, the survey markers, the official signs. This wasn't a proposal. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a negotiation. This was implementation. Someone had already decided the outcome, without me. Without my consent, without any legal ruling. The realization ignited a wave of anger, unlike anything I'd experienced before. But beneath the anger was something else. Fear. Real fear. Not fear of losing an argument. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear that powerful people had decided rules no longer applied to them. Fear that facts might not matter. Fear that a machine much larger than me had already started moving. And machines don't stop easily. I took a slow breath. Then another. Trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly, trying to avoid reacting emotionally, because deep down, a small voice whispered something important. This wasn't the beginning. The beginning had happened months earlier, behind closed doors, in meetings I never attended, in conversations I never heard, in documents I had never seen. What I was witnessing wasn't a decision being made. It was a decision being executed, and that realization terrified me. Because if they were bold enough to place a fence across my property in broad daylight, what else had they already prepared? What documents existed? What agreements had been signed? What stories had they already told neighbors? What legal traps had they already built? Standing there in the morning sunlight, staring at the orange fence cutting through generations of family history, I understood something with complete certainty. The land dispute wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that someone had declared war on reality itself, and before this day ended, I would discover just how far they were willing to go to make their version of reality stick. If this story had a villain, her name was Diane Whitmore, and the frightening thing about Diane wasn't that she looked intimidating. She didn't. She wasn't physically imposing. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten people openly. She didn't behave like the villains you see in movies. In fact, if you met her at a neighborhood barbecue, you'd probably like her. That was part of the problem. People often imagine dangerous individuals as obvious monsters. Real life rarely works that way. The most dangerous people are often the ones who appear reasonable while quietly manipulating everything around them. Diane had mastered that skill. She was 52 years old, impeccably dressed, endlessly polished, and almost impossibly composed. Every hair seemed perfectly in place, every outfit looked professionally selected, every sentence sounded carefully crafted before it left her mouth. She projected competence, control, authority, and people responded to it, especially in Cedar Ridge. When Diane first moved into the community nearly 8 years earlier, she quickly became involved in neighborhood affairs. At first, residents appreciated her energy. She organized meetings, improved communication, created committees, launched beautification projects, handled complaints efficiently. People admired her willingness to take action. The HOA board certainly did. Within a few years, she wasn't simply participating in the association, she was running it. Officially, she was HOA president. Unofficially, she had become something much larger, a power center. The person everyone needed approval from, the person who seemed to know everything, the person who somehow influenced nearly every major decision. Many residents viewed her as a hero. Others viewed her as necessary. A few quietly feared her. I belonged to that last category, not because of anything she had done directly to me, at least not initially, but because of how she treated people who disagreed with her. Over the years, I'd witnessed a pattern. Anyone who supported Diane became an ally. Anyone who questioned Diane became a problem. And Diane had a remarkable way of dealing with problems. She rarely attacked directly. Instead, she created pressure, social pressure, financial pressure, procedural pressure. The kind of pressure that slowly wears people down. One neighbor challenged a landscaping assessment. Within months, he found himself buried under violation notices. Another resident questioned HOA spending. Suddenly, every tiny infraction on her property became a major issue. A retired couple opposed a proposed project. They spent the next year fighting fines and compliance reviews. Officially, everything Diane did appeared legitimate, technically legal, carefully documented, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Opposition carried consequences. Many people noticed. Few spoke openly about it. That was how Diane maintained control, not through force, through fear. Standing in my field that morning, watching her calmly oversee the seizure of part of my property, I finally understood how far that mindset had evolved. Because this wasn't another landscaping dispute. This wasn't a disagreement over paint colors or mailbox designs. This was something entirely different. This was a direct challenge to ownership itself, and Diane looked completely comfortable doing it. That terrified me. Not because she appeared angry, because she didn't. She looked relaxed, confident, certain. The confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. I studied her face carefully. Years of consulting work had taught me something valuable. People reveal themselves in small moments, not through speeches, not through public appearances, through subtle reactions, tiny expressions, brief flashes of emotion, the things they fail to control. As we stood facing each other, I watched closely, and what I saw disturbed me. Diane wasn't acting like someone defending a legitimate correction. She was acting like someone protecting a carefully constructed narrative. There was a difference, a significant difference. I pointed toward the survey stakes. Who approved this? The board. No. I shook my head. I mean, who specifically approved moving a private property line 40 feet? She smiled politely. The association followed all proper procedures. That wasn't an answer, and she knew it. Who approved it? The board reviewed the survey findings. Again, not an answer. Just carefully selected language. The kind lawyers love. The kind politicians use. The kind people employ when they want to avoid direct accountability. I stepped closer. You keep saying, the board. Because the board approved the action. Who proposed it? A brief pause. Barely noticeable, but it was there. Then she smiled again. Why does that matter? There it was. Deflection. A classic tactic. Answer a question with another question. Redirect attention. Control the conversation. Most people never notice when it's happening. I did. And the fact she was doing it told me something important. The truth wasn't helping her. So she was avoiding it. I looked toward the workers, then toward the attorneys standing nearby, then back at Diane. How long have you been planning this? For the first time, her smile weakened, only slightly, but enough. What exactly are you suggesting? I laughed. A short, humorless laugh. I'm suggesting this didn't happen overnight. It didn't. The answer surprised me. She delivered it calmly. Almost proudly. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means we've spent months investigating discrepancies. Months. There it was. The confirmation. Months. While I lived my life. While I worked. While I maintained the property. While I believed everything was normal. They had been building a case. Planning. Meeting. Strategizing. Without ever speaking to me. Without ever requesting clarification. Without ever presenting evidence. Months. The realization felt like discovering someone had been secretly digging a tunnel beneath your house. I stared at her. And nobody thought to tell me. We followed appropriate notification procedures. I immediately knew that statement was misleading because I hadn't received anything. No meetings, no letters, no warnings, nothing. Either notifications never existed, or they had been designed never to reach me. Neither possibility was reassuring. Then came the moment that revealed Diane's true nature. The moment I stopped seeing her as an overzealous HOA president and started seeing her as something much more dangerous. I pointed toward the memorial bench dedicated to my grandmother, the bench now sitting beyond the newly claimed boundary. My grandmother's memorial is over there. Diane glanced at it. For a second, I expected some sign of empathy, some acknowledgement of what that meant, some recognition that family history was involved. Instead, she said, "Then you should probably move it before work begins." Just like that. Cold. clinical, detached, as though she were discussing lawn furniture, not a memorial, not a family landmark, not a place carrying decades of emotional significance, a bench, an obstacle, a thing. That single sentence told me everything. Diane didn't see stories. She saw assets. She didn't see memories. She saw parcels. She didn't see people. She saw variables. And once someone begins viewing human beings as variables, almost anything becomes justifiable. I noticed the attorneys watching quietly. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Even he seemed surprised by the comment, but Diane remained unfazed. She believed she was right. Completely right. Psychologically, that made her far more dangerous than someone acting out of greed alone. Greedy people know they're crossing lines. True believers don't. True believers convince themselves every action serves a greater purpose. Every shortcut becomes necessary. Every abuse becomes justified. Every victim becomes an obstacle. And obstacles are meant to be removed. That mindset radiated from Diane. I could see it, hear it, feel it. She genuinely believed her authority gave her the right to redefine reality, to rewrite boundaries, to determine ownership, to decide whose history mattered and whose didn't. The frightening part wasn't her arrogance. It was how many people seemed willing to follow her, how many residents trusted her, how many professionals stood beside her, how many systems appeared ready to support her version of events. For a brief moment, standing there beneath the morning sun, I felt incredibly small. One man against an organization, one property owner against an entire network of influence, one voice against a machine already in motion. And I think Diane sensed that, because she leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. Not enough for others to miss it, just enough to sound personal, almost friendly. Mark. What? You should think carefully about how far you want to take this. The sentence sounded harmless, but it wasn't. It was a warning, wrapped in politeness, packaged as advice, a threat disguised as concern. I recognized it immediately, and the moment I did, something changed inside me, because intimidation only works when someone still believes compromise is possible. Standing there, looking at the fence, the survey stakes, the lawyers, and the woman who had orchestrated all of it, I realized compromise had never been part of her plan. She wanted surrender, nothing less. And that was the moment I decided she would never get it, no matter what came next, no matter how powerful she appeared, no matter how many allies stood behind her, because for the first time, I understood exactly who I was dealing with. And understanding your opponent is the first step toward defeating them. The first violation notice arrived 2 days after my confrontation with Diane. More followed within days, and by the end of the month I had received more HOA notices than in the previous 15 years combined. I realized the dispute was never just about land. It was about exhausting me financially, emotionally, and psychologically. The notices targeted everything from my barn and vegetation to fencing and storage. Each issue seemed minor, but together they created constant pressure. Every time I responded with records, photos, and evidence, another complaint appeared. Then came fines that quickly grew into thousands of dollars, along with warnings of legal action, liens, and additional assessments. The message was clear. Stop fighting. Soon the neighborhood changed. People avoided me, and Sarah Mitchell eventually revealed that rumors were spreading. Diane had shaped a narrative claiming I altered markers, interfered with surveys, and hid documents. Online discussions amplified the accusations, turning me from a victim into a suspect. Many people began treating my resistance as proof of guilt. Anonymous complaints also brought repeated police visits, though officers found nothing each time. Still, the interruptions drained my time and energy. By the third month, I was exhausted. My work, friendships, health, and peace of mind suffered. Sitting beside the pond one night, I questioned whether I could keep fighting. Diane's strategy was working. I came close to surrendering, until I discovered a small contradiction hidden among the notices. It seemed insignificant then, but it was the first thread that could unravel everything. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when an old friend reviewed my HOA documents and quietly said, "These people made a mistake." After months of harassment, fines, rumors, police visits, and legal threats, hope had become difficult to trust. I sat surrounded by notices, surveys, maps, letters and emails when my phone rang. It was David Mercer, an old friend and respected property attorney. Sarah had told him what was happening. While many believed I was the villain, David simply said, "Then let's find out who's lying." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. The next day, David arrived and spent hours reviewing documents, surveys, dates, signatures and correspondence. He kept asking one question: who benefits financially? Eventually, he found something important. When I confirmed every historical survey contradicted the HOA's new boundary, he replied, "Then they have a problem." David explained that the HOA's goal wasn't compliance. It was controlling my attention and keeping me emotional. Instead of reacting, we needed strategy. Rather than rushing into lawsuits, we would investigate, document, verify, and uncover contradictions. He believed people like Diane become careless when they feel safe. Standing by the property that evening, he asked if I trusted the truth. When I said yes, he smiled. The truth leaves fingerprints. For the first time since the dispute began, I felt confident. The battle had finally begun, and I wasn't fighting alone. The most dangerous phase of the battle was the silence. While Diane Whitmore believed she was winning, David and I stopped fighting publicly. I stopped arguing with HOA representatives, responding emotionally, challenging rumors, and confronting board members. It looked like I was wearing down, exactly as Diane wanted. David called it strategic invisibility, because people become careless when they think they have already won. Every day I documented everything: letters, notices, emails, photographs, receipts and conversations. We built timelines of meetings, surveys, notices, approvals, and board decisions. Soon, troubling patterns appeared. Then David found a major contradiction. Official records showed survey results had been delivered before the survey was even commissioned. Either records were wrong or timelines had been manipulated. We expanded the investigation, documenting visitors, contractors, public records, planning documents and financial information. Patterns emerged. A construction manager connected to a proposed HOA Greenway project repeatedly appeared alongside Diane, and the project required the same disputed 40-foot strip. The more evidence we gathered, the more inconsistencies we found. At a board meeting, a resident asked about project costs, but Diane avoided giving a direct answer. Another clue: fear remained. The deeper we looked, the bigger the implications became. One evening, David explained that people who manipulate reality depend on nobody paying attention. We still lacked a smoking gun, but the contradictions kept growing. The truth was somewhere in the records. The only question was whether we would find it before Diane realized how close we were getting. Feverald Inner. The breakthrough came from a routine document archive. Late one rainy night, while reviewing hundreds of archived HOA emails, I noticed a message involving the construction manager connected to the proposed Greenway project near my disputed property line. An email sent 8 months before the boundary correction stated, "If the Dawson parcel issue can be resolved, the Greenway route becomes financially viable." At that time, there was no official boundary dispute, survey controversy, or public discussion. Yet my property was already being treated as an obstacle. As I continued reading, I found something worse. Another email, sent to HOA leadership including Diane Whitmore, discussed project feasibility and land obstacles. One sentence stood out: "Current surveys remain problematic. Alternative boundary interpretations may create additional flexibility." The wording was clear. They were not discovering facts. They were searching for ways to redefine them. I immediately called David. After reviewing the emails, he described the evidence as potentially catastrophic. The records showed the development project existed before the boundary dispute, and that my property stood in its way. Then we found a financial spreadsheet linking individuals connected to HOA leadership with development interests that could benefit from the project. The dispute was not about correcting records. It was about money. The final piece came from a board summary stating, Pending survey revisions should remain confidential until implementation strategy is finalized. The outcome had been planned long before the survey, fence, notices, and harassment. For the first time, we had proof. The evidence showed the boundary adjustment was planned first, and the survey was used to justify it. David gathered the documents and smiled. Now we send this to everyone who matters. Diane's greatest weapon had always been secrecy, and secrecy had just died. Stabilization. Objective. Had believed finding the smoking gun would end the conflict. I was naive. Exposing powerful people rarely makes them surrender. It makes them dangerous. Once Diane Whitmore realized David and I had uncovered evidence connecting the boundary dispute to financial interests and planned development, everything changed. The quiet war ended, and retaliation began. The first attack targeted my business. Clients began receiving rumors that I was involved in a property fraud investigation. The accusation was false, but designed to damage my reputation and create doubt. Then came unusual tax reviews and scrutiny of property records. Even family members, including my cousin Emily, received anonymous inquiries about me and our property history. David reminded me the goal was to provoke mistakes. His advice remained the same: document everything and react to nothing. Meanwhile, strange incidents appeared around the property. Tire tracks, moved survey stakes, and repeated security light activations. Together, they created constant tension and uncertainty. One stormy night, exhausted, I considered walking away. Then I opened Grandpa's notebook and found a note. Protect what matters before someone decides it doesn't. The doubt weakened. The next morning, David arrived with new HOA legal filings. He believed they revealed panic, not strength. The more Diane escalated, the clearer it became that she felt threatened. Fear leads to recklessness. Recklessness creates mistakes, and mistakes create consequences. The final showdown was approaching, and soon a judge would see the evidence. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of silence that makes your stomach hurt. Not because the world was quiet, because my mind wasn't. I barely slept the night before. Every argument, every document, every email, every survey, every threat, every lie, everything replayed in my head over and over again. By the time dawn arrived, I was already awake, standing on the back porch with a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. A thin layer of fog drifted across the pond. The oak tree stood motionless against the pale morning sky. For a few moments I simply stared at it. That tree had witnessed 4 generations of my family. Now it was about to witness something else. Judgment. Not just legal judgment. Moral judgment. The truth was finally stepping into a courtroom. And once it did, there would be no taking it back. At exactly 7:30, David pulled into the driveway. He stepped out carrying 2 briefcases and a rolling case packed with exhibits. Unlike me, he looked calm, focused, prepared. The kind of calm that comes from months of work. Months of knowing exactly where every piece fits. Months of understanding the story before anyone else sees it. "You ready?" he asked. I laughed nervously. "Not even close." David smiled. "Good." I frowned. "Good. People who aren't nervous before important moments usually don't understand what's at stake." That answer stayed with me as we drove toward the courthouse. The building stood in the center of Cedar County, a massive stone structure with tall columns and wide steps leading toward polished wooden doors. I've always believed courthouses feel different from other buildings, not because of architecture, because of purpose. Every person entering carries a story. Some seek justice, some seek accountability, some seek forgiveness, others seek victory. That morning I wasn't entirely sure which one applied to me. Maybe all of them. The parking lot was already crowded, and that was my first indication something unusual was happening. News vans, reporters, residents, community members, board supporters, curious observers. People filled the sidewalks. Word had spread, far beyond the HOA, far beyond the neighborhood. People wanted answers. As David and I climbed the courthouse steps, cameras turned toward us. Questions followed immediately. "Mr. Dawson, do you expect to win? Do you believe the HOA acted illegally? Do you have evidence of misconduct?" David guided me forward without responding. The silence felt deliberate, strategic. Everything would be said in court, exactly where it belonged. Inside, the atmosphere felt electric. The courtroom itself wasn't enormous, but it felt packed. Every seat appeared occupied. Attorneys shuffled papers. Observers whispered quietly. Reporters prepared notebooks. Even the air felt tense. Then I saw Diane. She sat at the defense table surrounded by attorneys. 3 of them. Expensive suits, expensive watches, expensive confidence. At least outwardly, but when I looked closely I noticed something different. Diane looked tired, not physically exhausted, emotionally strained. The calm certainty she once projected had faded, not completely, but enough. The change was subtle, yet unmistakable. Months ago she looked invincible. Today she looked worried. That realization strengthened something inside me. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Then the judge entered, the Honorable Judge Robert Holloway, a man known throughout the county for 2 things: patience and an absolute intolerance for dishonesty. Both qualities would become important, very important. After preliminary matters concluded, opening arguments began. The HOA's lead attorney stood first. He was polished, experienced, confident. His presentation focused on procedure, technical language, survey interpretations, administrative authority, boundary discrepancies, historical uncertainty. Everything sounded carefully crafted, reasonable, professional, and completely disconnected from reality. For nearly 40 minutes he painted a picture of an association attempting to correct an unfortunate mistake, a responsible organization, a difficult decision, necessary actions, good intentions. Listening to him felt surreal, because I knew what existed inside our evidence folders: emails, financial projections, meeting records, timelines, documents his argument never mentioned. When he finally sat down, David rose slowly. No dramatic gestures, no theatrics, no raised voice, just quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is not about a survey." The room became completely still. David continued, "It is about motive." He walked toward the evidence screen. "For months, my client has been told a boundary correction was necessary because new information came to light. A document appeared on the screen: historical survey records, county filings, decades of consistent measurements. The evidence will show no new information existed. Another document appeared, then another, each supporting the same conclusion: consistent boundaries, consistent records, consistent ownership. The judge leaned forward. The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Then David delivered the first major blow: the timeline board. Months of investigation condensed into one visual presentation. Dates, meetings, survey activities, board discussions, financial planning, every event connected, every contradiction highlighted. David pointed toward a specific sequence. "Your Honor, according to official records, survey conclusions existed before the survey process officially began." Silence. Absolute silence. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses. The defense table suddenly became very interested in paperwork. David didn't pause. He moved directly into witness testimony. The first witness was a county records specialist. Methodical, precise, professional. She verified decades of property documentation, confirmed historical surveys, confirmed ownership records, confirmed boundary consistency. The defense attempted cross-examination. The effort failed. Facts remained facts. The second witness proved even more damaging. A former planning consultant, someone involved in early development discussions, someone who initially seemed reluctant to testify until placed under oath. David approached carefully, patiently, building foundation after foundation. Then came the question: was Mr. Dawson's property discussed prior to the boundary dispute? The consultant hesitated. The courtroom felt frozen. Finally, "Yes." A ripple moved through the audience. David continued, "Were development concerns discussed regarding the location of the property boundary?" Another pause, another hesitation. Then, "Yes." The defense objected immediately. The judge overruled. The testimony remained, and suddenly the narrative began cracking. Not collapsing, not yet. Cracking. The real turning point arrived after lunch. The smoking gun. The emails. The documents Diane never expected anyone to find. David approached the evidence screen once more. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The first email appeared. If the Dawson parcel issue can be resolved, the Greenway route becomes financially viable. The room became silent. Then the second email. Current surveys remain problematic. Alternative boundary interpretations may create additional flexibility. Judge Holloway read the document carefully. Very carefully. I watched his expression change. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The defense attorneys objected repeatedly. Authenticity, context, interpretation, every argument imaginable. None succeeded. The evidence had already been verified, authenticated, documented. The emails remained. Then came the financial projections, the ownership interests, the investment connections, the potential profit incentives. Each document deepened the damage. Each exhibit weakened the defense further. Each revelation moved the case closer to collapse. Finally, David called the witness everyone had been waiting for. Diane Whitmore. The room felt charged with anticipation as she approached the stand. For months, she controlled meetings, controlled narratives, controlled conversations. Now she sat beneath oath, beneath scrutiny, beneath consequences. David's approach surprised everyone. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't hostile. He was patient, dangerously patient. Question after question, fact after fact, document after document. He allowed Diane room to answer, room to explain, room to commit. And gradually, contradictions emerged. Small at first, then larger, then impossible to ignore. Judge Holloway noticed. Everyone noticed. At one point, David displayed an email while reading Diane's earlier testimony aloud. The inconsistency was obvious, painfully obvious. For the first time, Diane looked genuinely shaken. Not irritated, not defensive, shaken. The confidence vanished. The control disappeared. And suddenly, the woman who once stood confidently beside an orange fence looked very different. Human, fallible, vulnerable. The final hours passed in a blur. Witnesses, arguments, documents, objections, rulings. The courtroom transformed into a battlefield of facts. And facts were winning. As closing arguments approached, I realized something remarkable. Months earlier, I stood alone in a field staring at stolen land. Now an entire courtroom was staring at the truth. The same truth Diane had spent months trying to bury. The same truth hidden beneath surveys, threats, harassment, and manipulation. The same truth my grandfather's records had protected for decades. Judge Holloway eventually called for a recess before issuing his ruling. The courtroom slowly emptied. People whispered. Reporters rushed toward phones. Attorneys huddled together. No one knew exactly what would happen next. But one thing had become obvious. The narrative Diane built was collapsing. And when court resumed, the consequences were going to be enormous. The longest 30 minutes of my life began when Judge Holloway left the courtroom. People always talk about dramatic verdicts. They talk about powerful speeches. They talk about the moment justice arrives. What they rarely discuss is the waiting, the unbearable waiting, the kind that twists your stomach into knots and makes every minute feel like an hour. As the courtroom emptied for recess, I remained seated. I couldn't bring myself to move. Months of fighting, months of stress, months of uncertainty. Everything now rested in the hands of one man. One decision, one ruling. Across the room, Diane sat surrounded by attorneys. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely frightened. Not concerned, not irritated, not frustrated, frightened. The difference mattered, because fear appears when someone realizes control has slipped away. And Diane had spent years controlling everything. The board, the meetings, the narrative, the pressure. Now she controlled none of it. David sat beside me quietly reviewing notes. I finally broke the silence. What do you think happens? He closed the folder. The truth. I laughed nervously. That's not an answer. It is today. Then he looked toward the defense table. They know it too. I followed his gaze. The atmosphere around Diane's legal team felt completely different from earlier that morning. The confidence was gone. The polished certainty had disappeared. Their conversations looked urgent, tense, desperate, like people attempting to stop a train after it has already left the station. The bailiff eventually called everyone back into the courtroom. Conversations stopped instantly. Seats filled. Reporters returned. Notebooks opened. Cameras prepared outside the room. The tension felt almost physical. Then Judge Holloway entered. Everyone stood. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. No whispers, no movement, no distractions, only anticipation. Judge Holloway settled into his chair and began reviewing documents one final time. Several seconds passed, then several more. Finally, he looked up, and everything changed. The court has reached its findings. Those 6 words immediately tightened every muscle in my body. Judge Holloway spoke calmly, methodically, deliberately. His voice carried throughout the courtroom. This case began as a property boundary dispute. He paused. However, the evidence presented demonstrates issues far beyond a simple survey disagreement. I glanced toward Diane. She stared straight ahead, motionless. The judge continued. The historical record overwhelmingly supports the plaintiff's ownership claims. Another pause. The court finds no credible evidence supporting the 40-foot boundary adjustment implemented by the Homeowners Association. A wave of emotion surged through me. Not celebration. Relief. Pure relief. Months of gaslighting. Months of accusations. Months of being told reality wasn't real. And now a judge was confirming exactly what I had known from the beginning. The property line had never moved. The truth had never changed. Only the story had. Judge Holloway wasn't finished. Not even close. The court further finds significant procedural irregularities in the actions undertaken by the association. The phrase procedural irregularities sounded polite. Far too polite. Everyone in the room understood what it really meant. The evidence had exposed serious misconduct. The judge then addressed the emails, the financial records, the planning documents, the hidden incentives. Each finding sounded more damaging than the last. The evidence demonstrates that development-related objectives existed prior to the creation of the alleged boundary discrepancy. Murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. The bailiff immediately called for order. Judge Holloway continued. The court finds that survey-related actions appear to have been influenced by considerations unrelated to accurate boundary determination. That sentence hit like a thunderclap, because it destroyed the foundation of Diane's entire defense. The survey was never about accuracy. The survey was about outcomes, and now the court was saying so publicly, officially, permanently. Then came the ruling itself. The disputed property shall be immediately restored to the plaintiff. I closed my eyes briefly. 40 feet. Every inch returned. Every marker invalidated. Every false boundary erased. The orange fence. The survey stakes. The manufactured line. Gone. Judge Holloway continued reading. The restoration order included complete removal of HOA-installed barriers, restoration of affected areas, correction of public records, correction of association records, formal recognition of the original property boundaries. Everything, absolutely everything. But the consequences extended beyond land, much further. The court ordered reimbursement of legal costs, survey expenses, document recovery expenses, property-related damages, administrative costs. The total amount grew rapidly, very rapidly. Each category represented another financial blow to the association. Then came the findings regarding HOA conduct. The judge ordered a comprehensive independent review of association governance practices, board actions, financial activities, development relationships, decision-making procedures, record management. The review would examine everything. Months of scrutiny, independent scrutiny, exactly what Diane never wanted. The courtroom remained completely silent. People understood the significance. This wasn't simply a defeat. It was exposure. Then Judge Holloway addressed Diane directly. Not the attorneys, not the board. Diane. The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's tone remained calm. That somehow made it more powerful. Positions of trust require transparency, accountability, and honesty. Diane looked down. For the first time, she could not meet anyone's eyes. The evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding each of those obligations. The words landed heavily. Every person in the courtroom felt it, because public reputations take years to build, sometimes decades, and only moments to collapse. The hearing concluded shortly afterward, but the consequences were only beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered immediately. Questions flew in every direction. Microphones appeared. Cameras rolled. People wanted details, explanations, reactions. The story exploded across local media within hours, then regional media, then state outlets. Not because of the property line, because of what the property line represented: abuse of authority, manipulation of records, hidden financial interests, public trust violated. The story touched something universal. People recognized it instantly. Over the following days, the community reaction became impossible to ignore. Residents who once remained silent started speaking. Former complaints resurfaced. Past concerns emerged. Stories appeared. Patterns became visible. Individuals who had quietly endured pressure suddenly found their voices, one after another. The silence surrounding HOA leadership began breaking apart. And once silence breaks, it rarely returns. Board members resigned, some immediately, others after attempting unsuccessful damage control. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Investigations expanded. Outside consultants arrived. Auditors arrived. Attorneys arrived. The organization entered survival mode. Meanwhile, the physical changes on my property happened quickly. Workers removed fencing. Survey stakes disappeared. Damaged areas were repaired. Historical markers returned. The visual reminder of the dispute slowly vanished. One afternoon, I stood beside the memorial bench dedicated to my grandmother. The bench sat exactly where it had always belonged, exactly where it should have remained all along. Sunlight filtered through the oak tree overhead. A gentle breeze moved across the pond. For the first time in over a year, the property felt peaceful, not threatened, not contested. Peaceful. David joined me later that evening. We stood quietly watching the sunset. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind all day. Do you think it's over? He smiled. No. I sighed. That's not very encouraging. It should be. He nodded toward the courthouse visible in the distance. The verdict ended the dispute. Then he looked back toward the land. What comes next determines whether justice actually means something. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I would soon, because winning the case turned out to be only part of the story. The harder question wasn't how to defeat Diane Whitmore. The harder question was what to do after defeating her. And that answer would define everything that followed. Section 13. Victory felt strange. After months of imagining relief and celebration, I felt only silence, the kind that follows a storm. A week after the verdict, I stood beside the pond. The fence, survey stakes, notices, attorneys and conflict were gone. The land was safe, but the community was not. Soon residents began contacting me, sharing stories of intimidation, unfair assessments, compliance threats, and fear. Though my land had been restored, many remained trapped by the same culture that caused the dispute. One evening, David asked, "What do you want your victory to accomplish?" The answer came slowly. Weeks later, I organized a community meeting where nearly 100 residents shared their experiences. I realized community mattered more than property. Residents later proposed creating a non-profit to educate homeowners about property rights, HOA governance, and dispute resolution. We founded the Property Rights Education Foundation to provide resources, transparency, and support. Over time, I released my hatred toward Diane, not to excuse her actions, but to free myself. Forgiveness meant refusing to let her mistakes control my future. Later, someone asked if I would stop the conflict if I could. I answered, no. The real victory wasn't winning the case. It was building a stronger community where people found their voices. Justice mattered because it created something better afterward. P4 passed since the judge measured my property and proved the HOA's claim false. 3 years since the orange fence, violation notices, sleepless nights, and courtroom battles. Today, peace has returned. The fence follows its rightful path, the pond is calm, and every morning I walk the land carrying my grandfather's old notebook, a symbol of stewardship and legacy. Near the oak tree, now called the Justice Tree, a bronze plaque reads, "Truth requires guardians." The community changed as well. HOA leadership was reformed, transparency improved, and many former critics apologized after realizing they had believed rumors. The Property Rights Education Foundation grew from local workshops into programs helping homeowners understand property rights and resolve disputes before they became lawsuits. David remained involved, reminding me that justice is not a destination but a direction that requires constant responsibility. My family life healed, and the property became a place for community programs and education. I no longer hate Diane. I chose peace instead. Looking back, I realized the fight was never just about 40 feet of land. It was about protecting truth, community, character, and the courage to stand for reality when others tried to rewrite it. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. This story reminds us that truth, courage, and perseverance always matter. Powerful people may create pressure and spread confusion, but they can never change reality forever. Now it's your turn. Have you ever faced an HOA dispute, property conflict, or unfair treatment? What would you have done? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to read your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories about justice, resilience, and ordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges. And always remember, protect what matters, ask questions, verify the facts, and never let anyone convince you that reality has changed when it hasn't. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.